Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Chopowick. I'm the Executive Director of Ontario Racing. We're here today to share more information about the long-term funding agreement for racing in Ontario that was announced by the provincial government on March 23rd. The framework for this funding agreement was shaped by public consultations that Ontario Racing conducted last fall, where we heard from hundreds of racing industry participants on the key elements of a long-term funding agreement that would best help build a sustainable horse racing sector and replace the current horse racing partnership funding program. With us today, we have legal counsel from OLG and Woodbine to explain the highlights of the funding agreement and answer some common questions. First, we'll have a presentation by Bill Ford from Woodbine Entertainment Group and Laurie Sullivan from Ontario Lottery Gaming. Following their presentation, we'll provide answers to questions until 3 p.m. Due to the large number of questions received, our presenters will synthesize many of the common themes of those questions in their answers. Also note, a recording of today's webinar will be posted on the OntarioRacing.com website, and you may also reach out to us directly following the webinar. Ontario Racing staff will be happy to help answer any other questions after the webinar.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Ford, and I work at Woodbine Entertainment. In September of 2016, OLG, Ontario Racing, and Woodbine Entertainment entered into a non-binding letter of intent, setting out certain key terms upon which the OLG would provide financial support to Ontario racetracks. Following the execution of that agreement, broad industry consultations were held by Ontario Racing. In fact, 2 rounds were done. We heard the industry, and from that, a report was provided by Ontario Racing that was given to the government. 2 key areas were very clear: that there was a need for more transparency, and I think Woodbine heard the point that there was a concern that Woodbine needed to act in the best interests of the industry. In the fall of 2017, OLG entered into negotiations with Woodbine and Ontario Racing to create the definitive long-term funding agreement, which would be based on the LOI and the consultations that were done. In January of 2018, an agreement in principle was reached between OLG, Ontario Racing, and Woodbine Entertainment, and in March 23rd of 2018, the government announced a long-term funding agreement for the horse racing industry that will provide up to $105 million for up to 19 years. Very exciting for the industry. That's over $2 billion in long-term commitments to the industry. In February of 2017, Laurie and I had the honor of addressing the industry in a webinar similar to this, where we went through the letter of intent. That letter of intent formed the basis for this long-term funding agreement. Some of the changes that were made to go from the LOI to the funding agreement focused on an increase in funding for signature and grassroots racetracks, removal of certain reductions related to potential increased slot revenue at signature and grassroots tracks, increased transparency in reporting, and finally, a clarity on the issue of that revenue generated in Ontario would benefit all of the Ontario Racing member racetracks. I'm just going to turn it over to Laurie now, who's going to go into more detail on the funding agreement.
Thank you, Bill. So now I'm just going to discuss details of the material terms and conditions of the funding agreement. And we'll start with the parties to the agreement. This frames out a lot of who is a party to the agreement and the purpose for them being a party. OLG OLG is a party to the funding agreement. It is providing the funding. OLG provides the funding to a new Ontario Racing, a new non-share capital corporation with members, and these members will be all the horse racing tracks in Ontario that conduct live horse racing, and industry participants, including associations for horse people and breeders, will also be invited to be members. Ontario Racing will be governed by a board, and this board, which will be discussed in more detail in this deck, will have representatives from the racetracks and from industry associations. Ontario Racing Management Inc. is also a party. ORM is a party as it is managing the affairs and operations of Ontario Racing. It does this at the direction of the Ontario Racing Board, and it is a wholly owned subsidiary of Woodbine Entertainment Group. Finally, Woodbine Entertainment Group itself is a party to the agreement. It's the current manager of the Standardbred Alliance and the operator of the one provincial home area market. For the purposes of the funding agreement, it is a party as it is the parent of ORM, and also it is subject itself as a racetrack operator to reductions in funding, which will be explained in some future slides, and it provides certain guarantees to OLG, which is also provided for in future slides. The term of the funding agreement. Funding under the funding agreement will commence on April 1st, 2019. There is an initial term of 7 years, and then there are 2 6-year extension options, which are automatically triggered if member racetracks conduct the number of race dates that is set out in each annual business plan in the previous years. OLG does not have the right to terminate the agreement for convenience. This is a commercial agreement between OLG and Ontario Racing, representing and acting on behalf of the racetracks that receive the funding. Termination can only be for an uncured material default by Ontario Racing of its obligations under the agreement to take the money and distribute it in accordance with the annual business plans. The funding agreement, when it commences, will replace the current Horse Racing Partnership Funding Program. The funding agreement will be the sole source of funding coming outside of the racetrack's wagering itself. Distribution of funds under the funding agreement. As I mentioned, OLG will provide funding to Ontario Racing. This funding will be managed and distributed to the racetrack members on behalf of Ontario Racing by ORM in accordance with annual business plans that will be created by the manager, then sent for approval by the Ontario Racing Board, then are reviewed by OLG, and OLG has the right to approve certain key portions of the annual business plan. For the first 2 years of funding, from April 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2021, the funding allocation is set, and it is based on the current level of funding that is under each racetrack TPA. That is what we call guaranteed funding and allocation to each track for the first 2 years, following the TPA extensions. So even though the TPAs will be canceled as that grant program is canceled, the allocation to each track of the funding that is currently provided under that program will be set out as a requirement to be paid to each track. WEG is also stepped in to provide supplemental funds at its own cost to the extent necessary to ensure that Ontario Racing complies with its obligations to run the race dates with the purse allocations set out in each annual business plan. This is what is referred to as the guarantees that I mentioned previously. Now we're going to break down the funding that OLG will be providing. This is exciting new funding and an increased amount of funding over the current Horse Racing Partnership Funding Program. First, we'll start with the racetrack payment, which is familiar to the racetracks. It is the essentially the current amount of funding that is provided under the program. I'll explain adjustments to that payment shortly, but I did want to explain that the funding does commence in April, and up until 2021, the allocation of this money, as I mentioned, will be as per each TPA that is currently with each racetrack. After 2021, the annual business plan that is approved by the Ontario Racing Board will allocate the funds. Inside for those funds are uses, required uses of the money. They are for purses, and up to 15% of the money, with a cap at $9.1 million a year, can be used to fund certain operating costs of signature and grassroots racetrack members. Additional purse enhancement payment, $4 million a year. This money will be used to supplement and enhance signature and grassroots racetracks purses. Capital improvements, $6 million. This money can be used for capital improvements at signature and grassroots racetracks. The amount will be guaranteed for the first 7-year initial term of the agreement, and thereafter, applications and proposals for further use of that money for the extension terms can be provided to bolster the continuing payment of those monies over next years in the term. An administration payment, $3.4 million. This money will be used by Ontario Racing to pay its administration costs and expenses, which would include a payment of a fee to ORM as the manager of Ontario Racing. So in this, we see the guarantee of the $91.4 million currently under the program, the guarantee of the allocation to that in terms of amount and uses for the first 2 years to match the program extension that's currently outstanding, and then moving to the remainder of the term allocated in accordance with annual business plans. And this includes an additional $10 million added on for purse and capital improvements. Funding reductions. This applies solely at this point now to Woodbine Entertainment Group operations. OLG will be able to reduce the racetracks payment to no less than $40 million in each year after 2021. The reduction is up to 51.4 in total, and it occurs because Woodbine Entertainment Group will be connecting new gaming rent from casino service providers, and that collection of rent will be applied dollar for dollar to reduce the amount of funding that Woodbine Entertainment Group can receive for its racetracks under the funding agreement. The cap on the reduction of $51.4 million is equal to the amount of money that Woodbine Entertainment Group currently uses directly to fund its purses under the horse racing funding program. For every dollar of deduction in the racetrack payment, that money cannot be allocated to WAG in the annual business plan as part of the racetrack's payment allocation. The next slide is a depiction of what I just described for funding. As you can see on the very far left, we have the final year, this year, of the Horse Racing Partnership Funding Program, which only consists of the $91.4 million in payment and approximately $2 million for administration fees for Ontario Racing. Next year, when we start the payments under the funding agreement, you'll see the 91.4 plus the $4 million for additional purses, $6 million for capital improvements, which is brand new, and then an increase in the administration payment to ensure that Ontario Racing has the money it needs to fund all of the programs and work that it does. Over time, if and when there are additional rent monies coming into Woodbine Entertainment Group, that money will be reduced as it will be not being paid to Woodbine Entertainment Group under the funding model. Excuse me for 1 second, just have a sip of water. Other funding reductions. After 2021, there is a mechanism in the agreement that if certain wagering targets are met by the live racetrack horse racing industry in Ontario, there could be reductions to OLG's funding. This slide explains that there are two formulas for calculating that reduction. The first bullet relates to wagering from all sources in Ontario. So wagering on races at racetracks located in Ontario and wagering on races that happen in Ontario, even though the wagering might be outside of Ontario. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. This is all about wagering on races that are conducted in Ontario. I apologize. If the total wagering handle is more than 1.2 billion in any year, then in the immediately following year, the racetrack's payment could be reduced by 5% of the amount that is over 1.2 billion. The next bullet describes a formula for pari-mutuel wagering generated by the racetracks from betting on live horse racing through any channel, but from customers located outside of Ontario. And customers outside of Canada wagering on races at racetracks in Ontario, sometimes called remotes wagering. If in this case that total amount of wagering is greater than 1 billion, then the reduction in the following year is 1.5% of the amount over 1 billion. These targets have been set very high and leave a lot of room for significant growth in wagering without any reduction to OLG's payment. Reporting and transparency. Under the funding agreement, Ontario Racing will be required to produce 3-year strategic plans, of course the annual business plans, of course annual audited financial statements, a compliance attestation to say they're in compliance with the agreement, and some quarterly and semi-annually financial reporting. Ontario Racing board members will approve and have access to all of this information. Members will have access to the annual business plan and the annual audited financial statements. Ontario Racing is also required to publish how funding is spent under the funding agreement. That would be a public document. Ontario Racing will be accountable to the horse racing sector for the distributions of the funds it receives under the funding agreement. The funding agreement also lays out 12 key performance indicators, and these will be publicly reported on a quarterly or annual basis, depending on the indicator. And this is for informational purposes for OLG and the industry. OLG also has the rights to audit Ontario Racing, the manager, and member racetracks that receive funding. In addition to the money that just described under the funding agreement, there is some additional racetrack transition funding that is starting to occur in this year. For 3 years, there will be available $3 million a year for purses and operating costs, starting this season. The first year of the funding will come under your existing TPA, and there will be supplements to that TPA to be executed by you to allocate to you the funds this season. The remaining 2 years, that allocation will be picked up and put into the funding agreement, be attached as a schedule, and that money will be paid by OLG to Ontario Racing, and Ontario Racing will be obligated to pay it as part of the annual business plan to the tracks that were receiving it under their TPA. Actual details of the amount of funding per racetrack will be discussed over the coming weeks as this is settled. Now I'm going to pass it back to Bill Ford, who will be talking a little bit more about who is Ontario Racing.
Great, thank you, Laurie. Who and what is Ontario Racing? The new Ontario Racing flows out of a proposed merger of the current Ontario Racing and the current Standardbred Alliance. It will be made up of all racetracks in the province. If a racetrack is racing live in Ontario and wants to receive government funding, this will be the only place where they will be able to get that funding. In addition, key industry stakeholders and organizations, including horsemen and breeders, will be brought in and be full members of this organization. The goal is to provide strong, effective, and efficient industry leadership with respect to issues affecting the entire Ontario horse racing industry. Let's be clear, this is about industry self-governance. It is for the entire industry. We can't be fooled. There will be lots of challenges, but we do believe that this will be the right model to deal with them in the long term. Ontario Racing will be led by its board of directors. There will be 11 seats. It is very key to recognize that it will be led by an independent chair. At this time, an independent chair has not been identified, but there is work going on to try and find the right person to lead this organization in the future. There will be 5 nominees that come from the racetracks and 5 nominees that come from associations. With respect to the racetracks, there will be 3 nominees coming from the Standardbred industry, 1 each from Premier, Signature, and Grassroots. And on the Thoroughbred side, there will be 2, 1 from the Premier track and 1 from the Signature track. With respect to the associations, there will be 3 board seats identified for Horse People's Associations, Quarter Horse, Thoroughbred, and Standardbred, and 2 nominees from the Breeder Associations, Thoroughbred and Standardbred. The initial board will be set out in the management agreement. It will closely mirror the current OR board, and they will sit for a 1-year term. This is to allow the organization to get up and get running. The independent chair will be filled as soon as possible, and it will be selected by the board. Then within a year of the organization, there will be an election where the new board will be put into place. It is key to recognize that each of the specific groups will select its own nominee to the board. For example, the nominee who comes from the grassroots racetracks will be put forward by the grassroots racetracks. We also have set up some rules around in the event that a group is unable to land on the right nominee, and they would be able to put a list forward, in which case the board would have to choose who the final sitting director would be. What are the responsibilities of Ontario Racing? I just remind you that this comes from a merger of the current OR and the current Standardbred Alliance. And so that the current responsibilities done by those 2 organizations need to land under Ontario Racing. One of the key things is to set out the strategy and direction of the province's horse racing industry. And how are they going to do this? Lori mentioned earlier the need for 3-year strategic plans and an annual business plan. It will be this board of OR that signs off on these and gives the industry the direction that they need. With respect to the annual business plan, once it is approved by the board, it will go to the OLG for its approval. The OLG will be looking to ensure that the business plan fits within the parameters set out in the funding agreement. In addition, the AGCO, as the regulator of the industry, will need to approve certain conditions of the annual business plan, such as the racing calendar. Some of the roles and responsibilities that are currently done by the Standardbred Alliance would also find their way as responsibilities for Ontario Racing. This would be managing a central race office, finding efficiencies in purchasing, moving resources around to tracks that need them at any given time. And then finally, The administration of the various course improvement programs would be the responsibilities of Ontario Racing. I do want to just make a quick note about the role of the Ontario Racing Management, which would be a subsidiary of Woodbine Entertainment, and it would be tasked with doing the administrative functions that the Board of OR asks them to do. So once the Board of OR, Ontario Racing, finalizes and signs off on the annual business plan, and it has received the necessary approvals at the OLG or the AGCO, it would be the responsibility of Ontario Racing Management to implement that annual business plan. One of the overreaching goals of Ontario Racing is to be fully transparent and to allow the industry to know what is happening within the industry. Members of Ontario Racing, be it racetracks or industry associations, will be asked for their input and feedback into how Ontario Racing should be run and key items that must be in the annual business plan and what's important for them. Racetracks will be asked to work with OR and ORM to implement the annual business plan. It will be very clear that they can only use the funding that is available to them as set out in the annual business plan, and they will need to assist Ontario Racing Management and Ontario Racing in the reporting and the transparency that is going to make this program a success. Industry members will be given a voice within the organization that is setting out the strategy for the long-term growth and survival of the industry, and we are very excited about that. Key membership agreement provisions. For those tracks that are currently members of the Standardbred Alliance, there is likely to be very little of surprise within the membership agreement. Two of the key items in there are cost allocation services. And what that refers to is that Ontario Racing Management will work with a track to understand what is a track really spending on putting on the races. Are there certain costs that can be borne by OR? We have recently had a successful bringing in of a new track, Rideau, into the Standardbred Alliance, and there were a number of costs that were able to be moved from Rideau over to the Standardbred Alliance, and that would be the model that would be used for other racetracks going forward. The parimutuel wagering revenue. The way Ontario Racing will work and the way the current Standardbred Alliance does work is that there is this concept of a pooled one home market area. The long-term goal is to share in this revenue according to a track's percentage of total wagering from all channels. Today, however, there is a deficit amount which has been backstopped by Woodbine, and Woodbine has said that it would do the same for this new model. But the goal is to grow the market so that the backstop can go away and true sharing can begin. However, those other tracks receive the benefit of not having the risk. If the growth does not occur, their purses will be set and will be backstopped by OR, as the current Standardbred Alliance tracks are backstopped today by Woodbine. I'm just going to turn it back to Lori to finish up here.
Thank you. So in summary, we see some key benefits to moving to the funding agreement model for the long-term arrangement versus today, the transfer payment agreements. First, we'll have representation for all industry stakeholders brought together under one Ontario Racing Board to begin to have industry self-management of its funding. There will be new money added to the program to the tune of $10 million per year for purse and, for the first time, capital investment, as that was an area of pressure that racetracks were raising during the consultations. There will be operational efficiencies across all tracks, as Bill was describing, through the central management of key costs and revenue sharing activities required by racetracks. There will be proportionate allocation of all revenues from all channels to racetracks, which non-Standardbred Alliance members today do not get to share in, but will under the new one funding agreement model. There will be more transparency in reporting to all industry members. And this all leads to an increased responsibility and opportunity for the industry to self-govern and manage its business and affairs towards greater sustainability with guaranteed long-term funding. Just some tactical points about how to become a member of the new Ontario Racing. Invites have gone out to the racetrack and industry associations for a leadership meeting. So this is a further meeting to discuss the details that we discussed today and answer questions. Also, there will be more detail given on how to enroll as a member. The two principal agreements are a membership agreement, which are signed by the racetracks and industry associations that will be members, and the funding agreement, which will be approved by the Ontario Racing Board and then entered into by OLG and Ontario Racing. We intend to post the membership agreement and the funding agreement shortly for viewing. Steps for executing the funding agreement. There will be reach out, as I just mentioned, to explain the documents again and answer any questions. Then members will be expected to sign the membership agreement to enroll. Once the membership agreement is fully signed, that creates that first board where the names are listed. That first board then sits and meets to approve the funding agreement on behalf of Ontario Racing. And then Ontario Racing, OLG, ORM, and WAG will sign the funding agreement. That will all be done in the coming weeks. And then funding under the funding agreement will be commencing April 1st, 2019. So the funding agreement will actually be signed in the coming weeks, but funding under it will not begin until after this season. The TPAs will stay in place for that period of time, and then the program will be terminated and the funding agreement will be the source of funding. Deadline for membership enrollment is May 1st, 2018. So we're moving quickly, but we are making a lot of meetings and a lot of time to reach out to people to answer their questions. That brings us to the end of the presentation, and now we'll be taking questions.
So the first question we have is, can I see the agreement and will it be posted publicly?
The answer is yes. We're working very hard to post the funding agreement and the membership agreement for viewing shortly. And the funding agreement will be a publicly posted document.
Okay. And many people have asked this question: is the agreement independent of whichever political party is in power?
Yes. This agreement is with OLG. It is not with the government or any ministry. It is directly with Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation as a commercial agreement. And OLG is bound by that agreement and must act in accordance with its terms.
Another question is, how will we know how the funding is allocated?
Well, as we described, for the first 2 years of funding, it's allocated in accordance with the existing TPAs.
Okay.
With respect to the following years, it's allocated in accordance with the Ontario Racing Board annual business plan approvals. When funding commences in April of 2019, the additional $10 million will be allocated in accordance to the annual business plan, right from the beginning. The transition funding will be allocated in TPAs and will continue until 2021.
Next question is, what are you doing to protect grassroots tracks?
Grassroots tracks are very important to the industry. The entire amount of the funding and the increases to the funding through the transition funding of $3 million a year for 3 years, and for $10 million in additional funding for the full term, 19 years of the term, are aimed at signature and grassroots tracks and are there to enhance their stability and their ability to perform. So I would say, in short, new money that is being provided by OLG to enhance their ability to carry on operations.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Another interesting question we received is having to do with the Ontario Racing board structure, the new board structure. Why did the Standardbred tracks get 3 directors and the Thoroughbred only 2?
Yeah, it's Bill Ford. I mean, we obviously wrestled with the right makeup of the board at some length, but I think at the end of the day, there was a recognition that the issues facing the grassroots signature tracks were unique, and that really they needed their own director to properly address those issues that relate specifically to those small grassroots Standardbred tracks. And seeing as the Thoroughbred tracks, we just have the Premier at Woodbine and the Signature at Fort Erie, it was felt that the 2 board seats there were appropriate.
Thank you. The next question we have here is, can all racetracks get a share of the revenue from off-track betting?
Yeah, so revenue generated from the channels like off-track betting will now benefit all tracks that are members of the newly expanded Ontario Racing. However, as I mentioned earlier, currently the amount of purses that are paid out and the amount of revenue that comes from all channels leads to a purse shortfall that is currently backstopped by Woodbine Entertainment. We are hoping to grow the amount of handle across the whole entire province, that in the future there can be proper sharing across all racetracks.
Okay, and again, I want to thank all the attendees for putting their questions forward. Another question we've received now is, when will Ontario Racing have its new board of directors in place?
So Ontario Racing will be created in the coming weeks. The membership agreements will be signed on May 1st. The board will be created by virtue of the membership agreements being signed immediately on May 1st, and that means the board is in existence. It will then call a meeting to approve the funding agreement for signing of the funding agreement within the following days of May 1st.
The next question we have is a 2-part question. Part A, what are the grounds for termination of the funding agreement?
When the funding agreement is posted, you will see that there are very few grounds available for termination. It's been drafted as a standard form commercial contract. So it's a material breach by the parties in dereliction of their duty to collect the funding and distribute it as per the annual business plans. There's a duty for members to be running and conducting live horse racing, and there are no terminations for convenience or anything of that nature.
Thank you, Lori. The second part to that question is, how will the 6-year extensions to the agreement be approved?
As I mentioned during the presentation, this is a very easy extension trigger. Simply the races that are required to be run under the annual business plans have to be run.
Okay. And the next question we have here is, one person asked this one, what options are there to grow funding and purses?
Yeah, I would say that with respect to the funding, there is not going to be any ability to increase the amount of funding. However, if we are able to increase the amount of wagering that occurs within the province in the long term, or remotes going forward, that there could be an ability to grow purses that way.
Thank you.
And if I might add, I think that OLG is hoping that the increase in funding for capital improvements and increases in purses will help supplement these opportunities and drive increased wagering across the province.
Okay. Thank you, Lori and Bill. Another question we have here is, how are you making sure that Woodbine Entertainment Group doesn't control the Ontario Racing Board?
Well, no one racetrack or association controls the board. As you can see, there's a very broad range of representatives on that board, and each one gets a vote, and each vote is counted equally. So there is no control body over that board, and it makes all of the key decisions regarding allocation of funding.
Thank you. And I think we touched on this during the presentation, but this question is, who is selecting the independent chair of Ontario Racing, and when will they be selected?
So the independent chair will be selected by the board of Ontario Racing, the other 10 members of that board. And the hope is that they will be selected as soon as possible. As most of you know, this is all happening very quickly, and there was just a government announcement at the end of March. So there is a push on to identify appropriate candidates and get them in front of the board, and then they will be put in place as soon as possible.
Okay, and Bill, you might be ideal for answering this one too. What is the difference between Ontario Racing and Ontario Racing Management?
Yes, so Ontario Racing is the government, or is the self-governing entity that is being put in place to oversee the province's horse racing industry. It will be made up of the racetracks and key industry stakeholders. However, for administration's sake, they're not going to build a huge infrastructure. They're going to pass their business plans and set the strategy, and then they are going to ask, pursuant to a management agreement that will be put in place, Ontario Racing Management and its staff to implement the business plan and to assist in the directions that are coming from the board. Ontario Racing Management will be a subsidiary of Woodbine Entertainment, and it will be able to draw upon the resources of Woodbine as necessary for it to fulfill its mandate.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Maybe Lori can answer this question. The question is, what are you doing for quarter horse racing?
When the Ontario government brought forward this funding model and committed OLG to the expenditure of the funds under this program, they had in mind support for the entire horse racing industry and participation by all industry members. And we would say that the funding for signature and grassroots racetracks, including quarter horse racetracks, is there to support for capital improvements, the 3-year transition funding, the continuation on a long term of the annual payment, the bulk of the funding. This is all aimed at helping the entire industry, and that would include the quarter horse racing industry.
Okay, thank you very much.
There has been a follow-up question. What is the quarter horse representation on the board? And quarter horse would have one board seat on the board, and it would be with respect to the Quarter Horse Horse People's Association.
That's great, thank you. Just bear with us here, everyone. We'll queue up the next question. Okay. Okay, how much is the transition funding?
The transition funding is $3 million per year for the first 3 years from today, starting under an extension of funding under the TPA program and then moved into the funding agreement based on the same allocations. And the actual allocations will be coming in the coming weeks.
And Laurie, which racetracks will receive the additional $3 million in funding?
Currently, right now, they are preparing these TPA amendments and will be reaching out to each track, and it will be for signature and grassroots racetracks.
Okay, thank you. This question here for Laurie, what will be done for racetracks that are losing their slot machines?
The government has looked at directing OLG to take on this funding model and looked at the long-term funding, the guarantee of the long-term funding, with the limited termination and the significantly improved capability to renew, to make sure that it is, as the government had anticipated, to be long-term funding. And this increased in funding to help racetracks as well. The separation of the business of gaming and racetracks has always been in existence, and the hope is that these racetracks will be able to use this increased funding on this long-term basis and work together as an industry for self-sustainability and longevity.
Thank you. And maybe perhaps Bill Ford can answer this question we got from one attendee. How do you distinguish between signature and grassroots racetracks?
This is a traditional designation and likely will need to be looked at going forward. With respect to the current Standardbred Alliance, it was quite easy to determine. Hanover and Clinton were clearly grassroots tracks, ran a summer weekend program that was really meant to, ensure that the grassroots participants had a place to run. Signature was tracks such as Western Fair or Flamborough or Grand River that run significantly more at significantly higher purses and are much larger operations. We will need to look at all of the new members coming in and to ensure that they are identified correctly and are in the right bucket.
Okay. A couple more questions here. What kind of reporting requirements will Ontario Racing have under the agreement?
Yeah, so Ontario Racing will be required to produce its 3-year strategic plans and its annual business plans, annual audited financial statements, and the compliance attestation both quarterly and semi-annually. And all board members will have full access to all of this information. In addition, it will be shared amongst the members. Additionally, Ontario Racing will publish details on how the long-term funding is spent. It will be very clear where every dollar of the long-term funding does go. Further, data on the 12 key performance indicators will also be published on a quarterly basis.
And Bill, I think perhaps maybe somewhat related to that is how will Ontario Racing oversee the long-term funding agreement?
Well, the board will be obviously reviewing the results of the industry. They will be seeing how that should affect the coming year's annual business plan and set the business plan accordingly. Again, they will review the 12 key performance indicators as the industry continues on and make changes to the business plan as appropriate over time. I think, exciting for the industry is that the long-term funding is solid and it will be there. We will need to adapt and changes to the industry as the industry changes going forward.
Okay. And Bill, this question here is, what is the job description of the chair of Ontario Racing?
It's probably a little bit early for me to say exactly what the job description is, because I think some of that will be set out by the board as they are put in place. But essentially, what we're looking for is somebody who has knowledge of the industry, yet is independent of any of the key stakeholders, so that they can truly play an independent role going forward. We would be looking for somebody who has some experience in dealing with government stakeholders, but we're also looking for somebody who can go out and get some consensus in the industry and get people excited about horse racing in Ontario.
Okay, thanks. That sounds great. And Bill, who will be responsible for industry marketing?
This would mostly fall on Ontario Racing, and that they would have discussions with the OLG as appropriate going forward. We would imagine that certain key industry marketing initiatives would be identified in the annual business plan, and plans would be then put in place to address those and make it work. In addition, each of the tracks would be responsible for their own local marketing going forward. However, ORM would be there to assist and to provide some materials if it was deemed advisable.
Okay. Lori, I think maybe you can help answer this question. What is the Racetrack Sustainability and Innovation Fund, and how does the industry access it?
Yes, thank you. The government, under its announcement, did announce additional monies through this innovation fund. This is being managed and offered by OMAFRA, and it is to support regional tracks by helping them innovate, diversify, and expand revenue sources to achieve long-term sustainability. Once in place, it will fund up to $2 million a year for 3 years. It will be an application-based program, and it will be available to regional tracks. And as I said, OMAFRA will administer it, and will be sending out further information as they get that program up and running.
Okay, we have time, I think, here for one last question. And for Lori, is there a dispute resolution process within the agreement?
Yes, there is, and it is a standard commercial dispute resolution process where there will be escalation through discussion, senior level discussion, and still, if there's a failure to come to a resolution, there would be arbitration available to Ontario Racing and OLG. But the agreement, may I say, is very simple in nature, in that it's the provision of money for purses, capital investment, administration, and so it's unlikely that there would be any dispute between OLG and Ontario Racing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, everyone, well, thank you very much for attending today's webcast. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of this webcast will be posted on the OntarioRacing.com website, as well as we will be posting as many of the answers to some of the questions we received today as well on the website. And as well, if you want to reach out to Ontario Racing directly to speak to one of our staff, we'd be happy to answer more detailed questions. And so thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.